You're interested in podcasting, you're a lawyer or a law firm, visit legalpodcasting.com or go ahead and fill out the form right here on the NJ Criminal Podcast. Thank you for listening. Picture this. It's August 2025, and somewhere in the marble halls of power, the very people who promised to drain the swamp are now telling us there's no swamp. They're handing us redacted documents like stale crumbs from a moldy loaf, while the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, the brave souls who dared to speak truth to power, watch their hopes crumble yet again into the familiar dust of Washington betrayal. Virginia Giuffre is dead. The woman who stared down princes and presidents, who knocked on doors from coast to coast seeking just one person with the courage to corroborate her shattered reality, is gone. And in her absence, we hear the thunderous silence of Adam Perry Lang, the celebrity chef who fed Epstein's guests while pretending not to see the parade of broken children served as dessert. We see the calculated theater of Ghislaine Maxwell suddenly being moved to a prison camp. Not the kind of place where you warehouse a convicted sex trafficker, but rather the sort of minimum security facility where white-collar criminals polish their memoirs. So, let's peek through this veil of manufactured ignorance. Let's explore how the Epstein operation wasn't some bizarre anomaly that crawled out of the shadows of South Florida. It was the logical, inevitable culmination of a system that's been perfecting the art of power through blackmail for nearly a century. Welcome to the New Jersey Criminal Podcast. I'm Tom, the producer. So far in this Epstein series, we've traced his mysterious ascent from college dropout to inner sanctums of global power. We explored the Maxwell dynasty and their blueprint for sexual blackmail operations. Meg Horner spoke with Christopher Mogg about Teterboro Airport as the hub of operations for Epstein's flying circus. In this episode, we're going to dig deeper into the machinery itself, the intelligence networks, organized crime syndicates, and financial architecture that didn't just enable Epstein, but created the very ecosystem where his operation could thrive with complete impunity. Because what we're dealing with isn't just a story of one predator, it's the story of how America's most powerful institutions became weapons of control, wielded by puppet masters who understand that the most effective chains aren't made of iron, they're made of shame, secrets, and the terrible leverage that comes from knowing what powerful people do in the dark. Let me start with what we're witnessing right now, because it's a masterclass in how power protects itself when the masks start to slip. We have Tara Palmieri, one of the finest investigative journalists on this subject, documenting in excruciating detail how Epstein's victims are being abandoned again. Virginia Giuffre spent years reaching out to Adam Perry Lang, a chef who traveled with Epstein to his island, his ranch, his Manhattan mansion. She left him handwritten notes pleading for just one person to confirm what everyone with eyes could see. In the words of Giuffre to Adam Perry Lang, please don't be an enabler. Be a hero. Be a hero to me, Epstein's victims, and the millions of children who are trafficked every day. Lang never answered, never testified. Like so many others, he chose silence over courage, comfort over truth. And now we are watching the same pattern play out on a national scale. Annie Farmer, who testified against Maxwell, can't even reach the prosecutors who worked her case because Maureen Comey, daughter of James Comey, well, maybe she was fired for the crime of being related to someone who is an idiot and can't control his impulses when he's on social media. Or maybe she got fired for being inept and letting Diddy walk and letting freaking Ghislaine Maxwell end up in a country club. Hard to say. I mean, the victims are writing desperate letters to judges, begging not to be left in the dark again, while Maxwell gets quietly transferred to what amounts to a country club with fences. And Ann Coulter offered some insight, of all people. Apparently, she had some dealings with Epstein and had some observations that sort of cut to the bone related to what we're dealing with. She's a woman who met Epstein before any of this broke, who was so creeped out by his frivolous attitude about wealth that she had his driver drop her blocks away from her apartment. She's been covering this story since 2006, and she's absolutely convinced of two things. First, that Epstein was funded by foreign intelligence, likely Israel and or Saudi Arabia, because the math of private blackmail simply doesn't add up. And second, that someone with immense power is working very hard to ensure that 300 gigabytes of evidence, including surveillance footage from cameras that were, quote, all over and particularly in the bedroom, unquote, that footage never sees the light of day. So she's got a point there. But it's Whitney Webb who provides, and I've mentioned her 20 times in this series, One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 and 2. It's awesome. Whitney Webb, who provides the most chilling context for what we're witnessing, she's been doing a series of recent interviews, and she points out that many of the people who were brought into Trump's administration specifically because they'd been vocal about Epstein conspiracies, like Dan Bongino or Kash Patel, have now been rolled out to tell us there's nothing to see here. Epstein killed himself. Case closed. Move along. I never thought it before. This quick sidebar. I'm starting to wonder if Epstein's dead at all. Now, the problem is, and this is Webb continuing, there's a huge segment of Trump's base that actually cared about this issue. They believed promises about transparency. They thought the appointment of these figures meant real accountability was coming. Instead, they got hostage videos and deflection campaigns about AI-generated footage of Obama getting arrested. This isn't just political theater. This is what happens when the puppet masters realize that one of their own marionettes is getting a little too much public attention. Now, how sexual blackmail became standard operating procedure. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to World War II, the moment when American intelligence learned that the most effective way to control people wasn't through threats or bribes, it was through shame and secrets. Our story begins with Lucky Luciano, sitting in a New York prison cell facing a 30 to 50-year sentence for running prostitution rings. But then something extraordinary happens. The United States government decides it needs the mob's help to protect the waterfront from Nazi saboteurs. What follows is Operation Underworld, a formal alliance between American intelligence and organized crime that would fundamentally reshape how power operates in this country. The man who prosecuted Luciano was Thomas Dewey. The man who negotiated his release was Murray Giuffre, an assistant district attorney who just happened to be a colonel in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. And when Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, it was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a transnational criminal network that was now formally wedded to the American intelligence services. And here's where it gets truly diabolical. The same networks that were smuggling drugs and laundering money were also pioneering the use of sexual blackmail as a tool of political control. Meet Louis Rosenstiel, known as the Chairman, who ran Schenley Distillers and was part of an underworld consortium with Meyer Lansky himself. Rosenstiel was obsessed with blackmail. He bugged his offices, his home, everywhere. He used private detective Fred Otash, the same man who tried to sexually entrap JFK, to wire his Manhattan mansion from roof to basement. But Rosensteel's masterpiece was something called the Blue Suite parties at the Plaza Hotel in New York. According to his fourth wife, Susan Kaufman, these weren't just social gatherings. They were elaborate entrapment operations involving Roy Cohn, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and young blonde boys. Kaufman testified that she personally witnessed Hoover dressed in women's clothing and a wig, introduced by Roy Cohn as Mary, engaging in sexual activities that were carefully photographed. The purpose? Well, Meyer Lansky now had pictures of the director of the FBI in compromising positions. The head of America's premier law enforcement agency was now a controlled asset of organized crime. But this is where it gets a bit more insidious. Roy Cohn, remember this name, because he'd later become Donald Trump's mentor, admitted to former NYPD detective James Rothstein that his job was, quote, to run the little boys, unquote, and set them up for blackmail to get politicians to, quote, go along with the program, unquote. He called it part of the anti-communist crusade, but what it really was just systematic sexual exploitation of children to control American politics. And it worked. For nearly 50 years, J. Edgar Hoover, quote, repeatedly declined to use the Bureau to target organized crime networks, unquote, dismissing it as a local problem, while these same networks grew so powerful they could essentially purchase entire industries and politicians. The financial architecture of corruption. Now, you might be wondering, how does a criminal network become so sophisticated that it can operate with complete impunity across multiple countries and intelligence agencies? And the answer lies in understanding how these groups learn to weaponize the global financial system. Enter Paul Helliwell, an OSS veteran who became the architect of what can only be described as shadow banking for criminal enterprises. Helliwell set up something called Castle Bank and Trust in the Bahamas, which served as a money laundering hub for organized crime, intelligence operations, and wealthy families who wanted to evade taxes. The bank's largest depositor? The Pritzker family of Chicago, whose Hyatt hotel empire was built on relationships with figures like Sidney Korshak, Meyer Lansky's logical successor, and whose early financing came from operations that were indistinguishable from loan sharking. But Castle Bank wasn't just about washing mob money. It was a CIA finance channel for operations against Cuba. When the IRS tried to investigate the bank's extensive network of tax evasion, the probe was shut down due to, quote, pressure from the Central Intelligence Agency, unquote, which claimed it would endanger national security. This is the key insight. The same institutions that were supposed to protect the public from organized crime were actually protecting organized crime from the public. And they were doing it in the name of, quote, national security, unquote. Now, a name that's come up in previous episodes, the Bronfman family, whose Seagram's liquor empire was built on Prohibition-era bootlegging, developed elaborate money laundering schemes using Canadian banks, shell companies, and fictitious individuals. They also allegedly operated hotels that were, according to testimony before the Giuffre committee, actually brothels. The best in the West, allegedly. When James Rutkin, a bodyguard, testified about these operations, he turned up dead, having allegedly slit his own throat with a borrowed razor in 1956. So, biographer Terence Robertson tried to write critically about the Bronfmans, died of barbiturate poisoning after claiming his life was threatened. And this is the pattern we see over and over again. Those who try to expose the darker side of these operations tend to meet unfortunate ends. The direct connection to Epstein's network. So how does all of this connect to Jeffrey Epstein? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you might expect. Epstein wasn't creating something new. He was inheriting and modernizing a system that had been perfected over decades. Consider the Pritzker family. Nicholas and Thomas Pritzker appear in Epstein's Black Book with extensive contact details. Their family's wealth originated in the darker corners of American business, dealings with Sidney Korshak using frontier finance as a mob-run loan sharking operation and partnering with Arthur Green, who facilitated investments for Meyer Lansky. They were also the largest depositors in Castle Bank and Trust, the CIA-protected money laundering hub we just discussed. Then there's Leslie Wexner, Epstein's primary benefactor, or likely primary benefactor. In the early 1990s, a former CIA proprietary airline called Southern Air Transport, which had been used to smuggle drugs and weapons during Iran-Contra, relocated to Ohio specifically to manage cargo for Wexner's Limited brand. That's Abercrombie & Fitch, that's Victoria's Secret, and so on. Jeffrey Epstein was directly involved in this relocation, creating a clear logistical link from historical intelligence, drug operations, to Epstein's network. Henry Crown's son, Lester Crown, later joined something called the Mega Group, co-founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman and mentioned in one of our previous episodes. This wasn't just a philanthropic operation, it was a constellation of families with documented ties to organized crime, intelligence operations, and illicit financial structures, all orbiting around Epstein's world. But perhaps the most chilling connection is Roy Cohn himself. The same man who ran sexual blackmail operations with young boys in the 50s and 60s became Donald Trump's mentor in the 70s. Cohn taught Trump what he called the favor bank system, a method of establishing backroom deals and political power through mutual compromise. In 1997, Trump became the controlling shareholder of Resorts International, a company with historical ties to Meyer Lansky and which had been acknowledged as a CIA front company. Hell, it started as the Mary Carter Paint Company before it turned into a global hotel operation. Trump buys into Resorts International, a known CIA front, and he buys Adnan Khashoggi's yacht, which we all know Khashoggi was running sexual blackmail operations for decades. When Trump faced bankruptcy in the early 90s, he was bailed out by Rothschild banking interests, primarily through Wilbur Ross, who later became Trump's Secretary of Commerce. Robert Maxwell, an Israeli intelligence asset, and Ghislaine's father was working for these same Rothschild interests on Wall Street during that period. Trump was photographed partying on Robert Maxwell's yacht alongside figures with organized crime affiliations. Maxwell was deeply connected to Russian-Ukrainian organized crime figures like Simeon Mogilevich, whom Maxwell helped gain international banking access through Israeli passports. Man, we can't get through an episode without somebody giving somebody a passport. The pattern's unmistakable. Epstein isn't just operating in isolation. He is embedded in networks that had been using sexual blackmail, money laundering, and intelligence connections to control American politics and business for decades. The modern surveillance state and the Palantir connection. So here's where the story takes a truly dystopian 1984 Terminator Skynet turn. Whitney Webb argues that while everyone's focused on Jeffrey Epstein, we're missing the bigger picture. His operation has been replaced by something far more pervasive and technologically sophisticated. Enter Peter Thiel and Palantir, which Webb describes as the new Epstein. Palantir is essentially a resurrection of the controversial DARPA program called Total Information Awareness, which was supposedly shut down after public outcry but was actually privatized to avoid scrutiny. Palantir now facilitates pre-crime through predictive policing and has access to vast amounts of personal data. Let me read that to you again. If you weren't horrified, think about these words. Palantir facilitates pre-crime through predictive policing. That sounds like straight-up thought police. They have access to vast amounts of personal data, search history, communications, social media. They can essentially predict what you're going to do before you do it, and they can use that information to control behavior on a massive scale. It gets worse. Israeli companies, some co-funded by Epstein and Thiel's Founders Fund, now manage America's 911 systems through a company called Carbine 911. Israeli cybersecurity firms manage U.S. military systems, Department of Homeland Security operations, power grids, and water supplies. This isn't about espionage. It's creating a system of total dependence where boycotting or opposing Israel becomes literally impossible because they control the infrastructure that keeps American society functioning. Webb describes this as a policy advocated by Benjamin Netanyahu and financier Paul Singer. Make Israeli companies so essential to the American economy and government that the U.S. cannot extricate itself from Israeli influence no matter what Israel does on the world stage. Ooh, that sounds contemporary. So we're not just talking about traditional blackmail anymore. We're talking about technological blackmail, a system where entire nations can be held hostage, not through compromising photos, but through control of the digital infrastructure that modern societies depend on to survive. The current cover-up and why it matters. Which brings us back to the present moment and why this administration's handling of the Epstein files represents something far more sinister than mere political embarrassment. And Ann Coulter makes a crucial point. If this were really just about protecting Donald Trump from personal embarrassment, why wouldn't they simply release everything that doesn't involve him? The fact that they're suppressing 300 gigabytes of evidence, including surveillance footage that could identify other perpetrators, suggests they're protecting a larger network. Whitney Webb's theory is that Trump may be protecting figures who are still very close to him, people with connections to Epstein that have never been publicly reported. She's begun a series called First Friends, exploring these connections, starting with Flavio Briatore, a longtime Trump friend whose name was circled in Epstein's black book by his former butler as a potential co-conspirator or material witness. But there's also the possibility that Trump isn't just protecting friends, he's protecting the entire system that put him in power in the first place. Consider this timeline. In 2015, the same year that Epstein's Black Book was published by Gawker, with Trump's name circled as a potential co-conspirator, several key events occurred. Alfred Rodriguez, Epstein's former butler who had circled Trump's name, died in prison under circumstances that were never investigated. Peter Thiel began suing Gawker into oblivion. Trump announced his candidacy for president, and Thiel and Epstein began meeting regularly. Put that all together, and you can take away the message that those who threaten to expose the network face consequences, while those who serve its interests are rewarded. The victim's perspective and the path forward. So perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire saga is how the victims have been systemically abandoned at every crucial moment. As Tara Palmieri documents, Annie Farmer and other survivors are writing desperate letters to the Justice Department, begging not to be left in the dark again. They remember what happened in 2008, when a secret non-prosecution agreement was signed behind their backs, dropping Epstein's potential federal charges from 60 to zero. They see Maxwell being moved to a minimum security facility, and they know exactly what it means. The system is preparing to let her walk. Arguably, the cruelest irony is that Virginia Giuffre died believing that justice might finally be possible. She had hoped that powerful people, Trump, Elon Musk, might finally release the files that would vindicate her story, help other victims. Instead, she did live to see those same figures weaponize her suffering for political theater, then discard the cause entirely when it became inconvenient. And that's not a statistic or a case study. That's a human being whose childhood was stolen, whose trust was shattered. These are people whose entire adult lives have been shaped by this trauma and this ongoing coverage, and largely inflicted by people who should have been protecting them, not Epstein and Maxwell. And so now they're watching the very institutions that are supposed to deliver justice actively work to ensure their abusers remain protected. The Epstein network understood something most people don't. The most effective way to control someone isn't to threaten them with violence. It's to make them complicit in their own degradation, to make them believe they can choose their fate, to make them so ashamed of what was done to them that they police themselves. This is why so many victims never come forward. It's why those who do are immediately attacked and discredited. The system doesn't just protect perpetrators. It actively cultivates an environment where victims become their own jailers. The choice before us. We stand at a crossroads that would have been familiar to our founders, who understood that power without accountability inevitably becomes tyranny, that secrecy without oversight inevitably becomes corruption, and that justice delayed is justice denied. The Epstein network wasn't an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a system that has spent decades learning how to weaponize our institutions against us. It took the tools of democracy, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, the financial system, and the media, turned them into instruments of control for an unaccountable oligarchy that views ordinary Americans as cattle to be managed, not citizens to be served. It seems, however, with the uproar, the activity, the fact that our last video got 10,000 views in 24 hours, that people care. And the human spirit's stubborn refusal to accept that this is simply how it works is a real problem for them. They're not counting on people like Virginia Giuffre, who spent her final years knocking on doors. They didn't count on journalists like Tara Palmieri and Whitney Webb. They didn't count on investigators like even Ann Coulter coming and has been telling this story for pushing 20 years. And they certainly didn't count on ordinary Americans who were just tired of being told the sky is green. Shut up, the sky is green. And nobody likes the idea of children suffering while their abusers get richer and more powerful. Yeah, I'd say people are at their end of their rope with this. It's between truth and lies, justice and corruption, a society that protects its most vulnerable members and one that feeds them to predators. The Epstein files may never be released. I don't think they're going to be released in our lifetime. 300 gigabytes of evidence that may remain locked away or be altered from its original form in some effective way. Ghislaine Maxwell may walk free. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when the most determined efforts are made to bury it, especially when it's just clear, straight-up bullshit. And every time somebody refuses to look away or raises a ruckus, and refuses to let these victims be forgotten, I think this network's power diminishes just a little bit. And I think that's where we are today. And I think that's a dangerous place. I think we're going to hear about aliens or a nuclear attack somewhere. I think the parties involved, without being specific, I think they'd let off a nuke before they'd let this truly come to light. So I think right now the best we can do is remember, investigate, support journalists and researchers doing this work. Hold your representatives accountable when they claim there's nothing to see here. Teach your children to recognize signs of predatory behavior. Understand that powerful people don't automatically deserve trust or protection. Looking at you, Bill Gates, you vax Nazi freak. And most importantly, we can refuse to let the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and all the unnamed co-conspirators who remain protected fade into the darkness that powerful people prefer. The puppet masters may control the strings of power, but they don't control the human spirit. Virginia Giuffre is gone, but her voice remains. Children trafficked through Epstein's network may never get their day in court, but their stories still have power. And the truth is still overwhelmingly buried between years of classification and legal protection. But it's creeping out and people are losing their minds. And in the end, that might be enough. This has been the NJ Criminal Podcast. Keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, keep your head down. In a democracy, people are supposed to be the ones pulling the strings. We've got some research credits here. I took from Tara Palmieri's recent investigative podcast on the Tara Palmieri Show. Ann Coulter's interview was just a few days ago on the Winston Marshall podcast. Winston Marshall is the former ukulele player for Mumford and Sons. Just throwing that in there for no particular reason. Whitney Webb's appearance on the Bad Faith podcast and her book, One Nation Under Blackmail. Extensive documentary evidence about organized crime, intelligence operations, financial corruption networks spanning from World War II to the present. You're interested in podcasting, you're a lawyer or a law firm, visit legalpodcasting.com or go ahead and fill out the form right here on the NJ Criminal Podcast. Thank you for listening.